So in the next part of this series, I'm basically going to show you how I made the top. This top has breadboard ends, so that's usually a fairly involved process. It takes a little bit of time. So most of this video is going to be that particularly. It's not going to be super long because the finishing process would have been too long to fit into this video, so it's actually going to be 3 parts. I don't like to make these too long. They feel, even when I watch YouTube videos, sometimes when videos are too long, it can almost feel daunting watching them, so I try and keep them around 15 minutes. So this is going to be a 3-part series. The second part's going to be mostly the tabletop. And also, I'm going to go through it fairly quickly because I do have a very long, in-depth video on my channel showing you how I make breadboard ends. So instead of doing a very detailed video on it, I'm going to kind of shorten it up, do a shortened version of it, and then if you're interested in learning a little bit more of the details that go into making it, you could watch the other video. So this right now is just about done. It has 2 coats of finish on it. As soon as I'm done filming this intro, I'm going to put the 3rd coat on it, and it will probably need a 4th. And then it'll be ready to cure. So I'm obviously not going to be planing these boards because I want to keep them rough sawn. So I'm repurposing a planer jig that I use for my planer that turns the planer into a jointer. And I'll still be able to use it, but I'm also going to be making it a straight edge ripping guide for my table saw. So I basically just marked a line down the center of the original jig. I used a straight edge, which is just a piece of oak I had laying around. I'm using a 1/4 inch router bit to rip a groove right down the middle of the board. I'll be able to put clamps in this groove and clamp wood onto the top of this to the top of this jig. So I'm going to go all the way through the piece, and this is melamine, so it didn't route super nicely, but it was routed well enough for the purposes I'm using it for. And then I flipped it over, and on the bottom side of the jig, I'm routing with a 3/4 inch straight cutting bit, a groove deep enough to receive a T-bolt, so the thickness of the head of a T-bolt, so that it doesn't scratch the top of your table saw. You can see that fits in there now. And I could use these clamps that are clamps you use with T-bolts, and some screw hardware. And I use these all around the shop. They're super versatile, and now I could safely clamp boards onto the top of this. So then I'm going to rip cut these down to rough size. These are 8-foot pieces of red oak. I'm going to cut them down to a little over 6 because the tabletop is a little over 6 feet long, and you'll lose some inches with the breadboard. Then I have this roughly lined up over the groove I have. I use that groove as my straight edge eye. I mark this by eye, and then I could just ride it down and get a straight edge on that board. You can see that was the side I did not cut. This is the side I did cut, and this actually worked really well. These turned out all pretty straight. You can see with a level there's no daylight coming through, so I had nice straight edges. So this board is pretty bowed, and you'll see I'm going to rip one edge. I still have the bow on this one edge, and then with the jig I'm left with a nice straight edge on this side. So I did this to all of my boards, and then once that was done, I could use the straight cut edge against the fence and rip a little piece off, so now both sides are essentially square. This lumber is still rough cut, so you can see there's still some cups and some bows in it. So sending this stuff for the table saw, you have to be really careful because this is the type of material that will pinch between the blade as it rides on those cups and then twists on you. So all these turned out pretty straight. A couple of them I had to go back through and cut again, just a little bit off. But for the most part, that jig worked well enough for the purposes I needed it for. So you can see I could put all my boards together. There was, like I said, little gaps, and then I think one board I had to go through and recut. And then I could put glue on all the edges and clamp these together. Now, since these are rough cut, I made clear to the customer that in order to keep that reclaimed look, and you would have the same problem with reclaimed lumber, the tabletop itself is not going to be perfectly flat. As long as the customer is okay with that, I don't mind making tables this sort of way. So
there is going to be some undulations in the top. That's just the way the nature of the beast when you're not planing lumber. So I tried to clamp it as well as possible to flatten it out, and then you could see I put C-clamps on the edges for some of the bigger parts that were pulling up or pushing down. But it came out pretty nicely at the end. So then in order to straight cut this edge so I could start on my breadboards, I just put a level on the board, put 2 squares on the end so I know the level was straight, and then I could make a mark and just rip this with my saw. So because the edges are all rough cut, you can't really use a tape measure to do this because it would leave differences on the edge of the board, so that's why I used the square with the level. And once I had my straight cut, I already had lumber milled up. I milled this up the same way I did the boards. I milled up extra lumber. For the breadboards, these are a little over 4 inches long, and the breadboard with the tenons are going to go about 2/3 of the way in. So I just lined this up on the edge of my board and drew a straight edge. So in order to cut this, I'm going to be using a jig that's basically just a scrap piece of the table, and those are sandwiched between 2 pieces of 3/4 inch ply. I could put that jig in place, line up the router with the mark I made where I wanted to cut it, clamp it in place, and then I could flip the board and it will cut to perfect grooves on either edge. So I'm going to be leaving about a 3/8 of an inch tenon on these, so you could see those are the marks of how far I'm going down. I set that depth on the router, and then I could just start routing the edges. So this jig is great because if you flip the board and your 2 grooves that you're making are not the same, you'll have a big gap on your breadboard on the top or the bottom. You can also see, because these aren't perfectly flat, that you're going to be routing some material takes a little bit longer to remove than the other since it's not one flat surface. But I'm just going to make a couple passes, go down with the router, and get that groove in the back of my piece. Now before, I would just route all this excess material, but in my breadboard making video, someone recommended using a handheld planer, which I have, to remove all the excess, and this works really well. A couple passes with this and I can remove all the material. It's much faster than doing it with the router. And you can see underneath this rough sawn lumber is really nice clean red oak. So once that's flat and looks good, I could flip the whole board. It's kind of what it looks like. You can see with the router you're leaving a nice flat surface. There's not going to be any undulations, which is good. So I just flipped the board, I didn't move my jig, and then I could do the exact same thing on this side. You can cut that groove and then remove the excess. Kind of making sure that those 2 edges line up. So then I marked out the material I'm removing. I'm keeping a haunch tenon at the end, which is 3/4 of an inch. I pretty much start from the center and then work my way out. My tenons aren't perfectly the same size just because of the width of the board, and I take 1 inch off either edge. So once I had that marked, I went through and screwed some holes at the edges, which will be for sawing out those pieces. So I'm going to use just a regular saw to rip cut down the marked edges. This is pretty easy work. I'm not cutting into the haunch, and then cutting the 2 edges come completely off. You can see the 2 edges come completely off. You could keep them, you'll just have a mark in your breadboard. If you don't, you'll see that groove on the edge. And then using those holes I drilled in there, I could use a coping saw to completely cut out the X portions. So the reason I'm doing this is because if you have one full tenon, then that board is more susceptible to the changes in humidity. If you break it up into those pieces, the movement is usually not as severe. So that's why there's multiple, about 4-inch tenons. So then for the breadboard, this is the part I'm cutting right now, which is going to go over the haunch. So it's a 3/4 inch groove right in the center of that breadboard, and it's about, like I said, 3/4 inch deep, and it's 3/8 of an inch thick, because this is the tenons is about 3/8 of an inch. Once I had that, I just set this on top of there. make my marks, and then I could use my mortise and jig to remove the rest of the material. So you can see I have that dado already cut. Now this one I'm showing you because I actually miscut this. Mistakes happen to everyone, so I had to completely redo that breadboard. I cut the negatives instead of the positives, so that was a huge bummer, but it was somewhat easy to recreate it, and this is the new one that I'm cutting properly. In my breadboard video, I didn't have this mortising jig working at that point, so I used a drill press. So you can use a drill press to cut these. The mortising jig is just much easier. So then once I had all those mortises taken out, I could hammer this into place. These should be a nice tight fit, not too tight where you're pounding on it to get it into place, but a nice tight fit. You could see it fits nicely against those boards. So for the other edge, I had a couple marks in order to figure out where to cut this. You're basically calculating how much goes into the breadboard, which you use from the other edge. You could cut the other edge and do the exact same thing. I don't film it because it's the exact same process. Then I drilled 5/8 inch holes through all the centers of my tenons, and then I'm marking on the tenons where those holes align. This is one of the reasons you make your breadboard longer, so that you can hammer on and off. If you don't have that little lip there, it's a pain in the butt. And then I cheat up a little bit on those marks so that these turn into a drawboard application. So it will actually pull the breadboard towards the edge. And then I use 5/8 inch dowels for this because that's what I had. It's probably a little bit on the big side. It's not going to hurt anything, but I usually use smaller ones. And I just elongated those holes with a chisel so that when seasonal humidity either expands or shrinks the breadboard, it can move with it. So the center one's the only one you're actually gluing, and then movement can happen out from the center, which is why you have those elongated holes. I can hammer everything in place, and then I could put the dowels through. So once again, the center, you can see how it's going in a little crooked, and that's what's pulling that doweled drawboard hole towards the breadboard. I could just remove the excess and go down the whole way. And like I said, both ends I did the exact same process. The next day I could come through and remove the tops of those dowels and then trim off those edges. If I remember, I'll have to film it because it went from about 90 degrees and humid to about 60 degrees and cool in the matter of a week. And the breadboard has actually shrunk since then, so it's nice to know that it works. And then this is, right after the video, I put on a third coat of finish, so this is what it looks like right now. So the next video will be finishing up the couple little finishing touches on the table and the finishing process.